Thank you all so much for joining us for this event, which has been made possible through the joint partnership of the Institute for Public Policy Research, the Namibian newspaper, the Hanns Seidel Foundation, and the Embassy of Finland. In June 2015, the 4 project partners hosted the 100 Days of Geingob event. In March 2016, we held the 1 year of Geingob assessment, and today we look at the President's 3 years in office and the Harambee Prosperity Plan at halftime. Should you wish to engage with us on social media, please use the hashtags 3 years of Geingob or Harambee at halftime. Before we get into the heart of this discussion, allow me to call on the Namibian's acting editor, Christoph Maletsky, to welcome you all officially. Christoph?
Good evening, friends. I'm honored to welcome you all tonight to this third occasion where we are looking through and analyzing through well-versed panelists the hits and misses of the Geingob administration, as well as Harambee at halftime. 3 years ago, we witnessed the inauguration of a new head of state, and almost everyone spoke of a fresher look at things, fresher look at governance. And the president used, at his inauguration, used the Namibian House analogy to lay the first bricks on the 21st of March 2015. In that speech, the president said that he will address, or his administration will address, the socio-economic gaps that exist in our country. He specifically used, and I quote, "People don't eat constitutions. They don't eat peace, and they don't eat democracy. People eat decent food. They live under decent shelter and enjoy decent employment. Because every plan and everything that we intend to do has a time for reflection and assessment. We are using today to look at the past 3 years. We have Graham Hopwood from IPPR. We've got Indileni. We've got Mr. Venani from the official opposition. And then we've got the President's Special Advisor on Economic Affairs, Dr. Steidler. Please feel free to engage. It's a night of sharing ideas, exchanging ideas. It is a night of interaction. I hope you will be comfortable in asking whatever is on your mind, because the event is just about that. The discussion will be followed by many others outside there through our social media. We hope frankness will prevail tonight. I thank you all.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, exactly 2 weeks ago, on Namibia's 28th Independence Day, President Hage Geingob marked his 3rd year in office. In his speech on that day, he remarked that after 28 years, it is time to take stock, assess the road going forward, and see how best we can accomplish the urgent tasks of unity and shared prosperity. Tonight, we wish to do just that, to take stock of the successes and challenges over the 3 years, and to share insights on how best to achieve our nation's development objectives. For the purpose of this discussion, we will look at the past 3 years specifically, as well as take stock of the Harambee Prosperity Plan 2 years into its 4-year trajectory. That said, we also take cognizance that both these things are informed and affected by the past, by economic conditions, by the political and policy landscape, and so forth, which I'm sure will weave their way into our discussion tonight. Allow me to provide a general context for this conversation. About 2 years ago, in this very room where we are, we assessed the President's performance on his 1st anniversary in Namibia's highest office. That assessment explored the impact the President had made against the promises stated in his inaugural speech, as well as in his State of the Nation address in 2015. During that assessment, many agreed that the president's first year had been one of laying the right foundations in the building of what the president has termed, and I quote, a new Namibian house in which no one should feel left out, where no one should go hungry, and where all inhabitants should have decent shelter, access to basic amenities such as safe, potable water, access to quality education, and adequate health services. Many agreed that positively, the president had shown consultative leadership by holding numerous public town hall meetings and various stakeholder engagements to effectively identify the key priorities for his time in office. And importantly, many also agreed that by the end of the president's first year in office, we had heard enough talk and we were now in need of action and implementation. And indeed, when the president made his State of the Nation address on the 5th of April 2016, a couple of weeks after the 1 year of Geingob event, he dubbed that year the year of implementation and launched the Harambee Prosperity Plan. As a side note, 2017 was dubbed the year of rededication, and as we know, 2018 is the year of reckoning. So back to Harambee. As you can see, or will see on the slides on either side of the stage, the Harambee Prosperity Plan outlines the key priorities for the period 2016-17 to 2019-20, essentially to the end of the president's first term in office, although some of the objectives go beyond that. This is done along 5 pillars: effective governance, economic advancement, social progression, infrastructural development, and international relations and cooperation. These 5 pillars are then further broken down into 16 goals, and these goals are then detailed in 41 stated targets, each with their own strategies and action plans. So I'll provide just one example of how this is done. Under the social progression pillar, for example, are 4 goals, one of which is hunger poverty. The target stated for that goal is there will be 0 deaths in Namibia that can be attributed to a lack of food. And the proposed strategies to achieve this outcome include, amongst others, the implementation of the poverty eradication blueprint, emergency assistance, improved agricultural output, the administration of targeted social safety nets, the establishment of a national pension fund, a state lottery, and an investigation into the feasibility of a national minimum wage. So for each of these pillars, as you can see, and these goals, the plan provides reasonable detail on how the stated targets will be achieved and which ministry is responsible for ensuring that those targets are met. For an event of this nature, for researchers such as myself, for our panelists, I'm sure this evening, and for public accountability in general, a plan like the Harambee Prosperity Plan is like manna from heaven. Why do I say this? Because it provides us with a very clear framework of what the president says we should expect of him, the time frame in which we can expect him to deliver results, and the entities we can call out when implementation is not being met. Of course, several else has happened since the Harambee Prosperity Plan was launched. Many speeches have been made that highlight the president's priorities. The NDP 5 has been launched. The economy has experienced a downturn. The SWAPO party has affirmed President Geingob as their leader, the party leader, during their Congress in November last year. A cabinet reshuffle took place for the first time during President Geingob's presidency, and the list goes on. These happenings, I'm sure, will find their way into our engagement this evening, but our focus will simply be on the president's performance against the Harambee Prosperity Plan targets. Dear friends, I'm incredibly excited about our panel this evening, who will present their analysis of the president at 3 years and Harambee at halftime, and who will provide some food for thought for an enriching discussion this evening, in the order that they will be making their opening remarks. First, we have Mr. Graham Hopwood, Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research. Graham will provide a political perspective of the president's time in office so far, with some insights of the highs and lows of his presidency. Second, we have Ms. Indileni Nangonga, an economist and an analyst at Simonis Storm Securities. Indileni will speak to the state of the economy and whether or not we are on track to meet the objectives set out in the economic advancement pillar of the Harambee Prosperity Plan. Third on the panel is Mr. McHenry Vanani, leader of the official opposition, president of the Popular Democratic Movement, formerly known as DTA Namibia. As you know, the role of opposition parties is to keep governments accountable to the public, to challenge policies, and to propose alternatives where necessary. We have asked Mr. Vanani to provide an assessment of the president's time in office from that perspective. And finally, we have Dr. John Statler, economic advisor in the Office of the Presidency and former head of Namibia Statistics Agency. Dr. Statler will provide an overview of the progress made to date in meeting the targets set out by the Harambee Prosperity Plan. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Each panelist will be given 7 minutes to make opening remarks. I have asked them to stick to their allotted time to ensure maximum engagement with you all during our Q&A session, which will follow their remarks. We will engage with you for about 35 minutes, following which our panelists will then have closing statements, each of about 3 minutes each. In those closing statements, I have also asked them to keep them solutions focused. Should you wish, again, to engage directly with the panel on social media, and we will be calling out some of the Facebook and Twitter engagement that comes through, you can use the hashtags 3 years of Geingob or Harambee at halftime. So to get straight into our discussion, Graham, I'd like to start with you and to ask you, as a political analyst, what have you seen as some of the positives and the negatives of President Geingob's time in office thus far? What stands out most for you? And what do we need to see more of in meeting the Harambee Prosperity Plan targets and other development objectives? Graham?
Good evening, everybody. I've been asked to be short and sweet, so I'll dispense with all the protocol if you don't mind. I might not be completely sweet. There's a few sour notes, but I'll try not to be bitter. I think in the past 2 events that we've had like this, the 100 Days event and the 1 year of Geingob event, we have credited the President for setting the tone for improved governance and service delivery through his rhetoric in particular on the Namibian House and on inclusivity. But as he stated himself, after the rhetoric comes the reckoning. And this year, it is appropriate that the government's record should come under closer scrutiny. If you look around the world, I can't think of a politician globally who has more political capital at the moment than our president. He won a presidential election in 2014 with 87% of the vote. That's almost unheard of in an election that's generally seen as free and fair. And now, after the swap of Congress, he has a firm grip on the ruling party as well. It has to be said that many leaders who have such mandates often end up abusing them. We know from the saying that absolute power corrupts, and often these countries are not democracies. We can be thankful that Namibia's democracy remains intact, and while government heavy-handedness may be a concern in some areas. For example, the suggestion that the media should be regulated by the state that came up from a State House spokesman at the end of last year. And also for us, particularly at the IPPR, the draconian research law and regulations that we face, that we are now fighting in the High Court on constitutional grounds. I do think that introducing the performance evaluations for public officials, including at cabinet level, has been an important step forward in terms of accountability. It's not the perfect system at the moment, but a system has been put in place. It can still be improved and fine-tuned. I do think we have to recognize the economic difficulties the government has faced since 2015, and I do give credit to the government for the way it has sought to gain control over the budget. Principally to ensure that we don't build up a level of public debt that is unsustainable in the future, because we can't have a situation where the future generations are having to pay for the debts that we incurred at this time. I like Harambee. It's good to have a focused plan, and it has very clear targets and timelines. It's a risk because it can set government up for failure, because it has such clear targets and timelines. But it does have clear advantages, particularly if there are regular public progress reports and public engagement. So we do need to move faster and more effectively, but we also need to be honest about our failures. We need to have honest discussions. Have we ever discussed, for example, the fact that NDP4, in terms of its desired outcomes, failed in almost every respect? So, you know, we need to be honest and say where we are failing and have proper discussions about where we can go next and how we can achieve what we want to achieve in the future. So I want to end on a positive note and say, look, let's be the example, not just for SADC, not just for Africa, but globally. We can do that if we raise our game. It says time's up on the red sign in front of me, so I'm going to stop now.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you for keeping within your time. Just on a side note, before I ask our next panelist for her interventions, the IPPR has put out this publication on 3 years of Geingob. If you haven't already received one, you can get one on your way out, which really just looks at some of the highs and lows so far of his presidency and of the Harambee Prosperity Plan. Indileni, if I can move over to you now and just ask you, are we on track to meet some of the objectives set out in the economic advancement pillar of Harambee? How has government performed economically, and have the right measures been taken with respect to the budget in terms of addressing the challenges that we see?
Good evening, and thank you. Just looking at when the president took off, he committed himself to address a number of priorities in his administration, mainly focusing on the socioeconomic gaps that exist in the society. And I will just highlight on a few of the targets that have been set. The president promised to work towards propelling the economy into a new period of fast growth. And we should note that the president inherited a model, and a lot of things have happened during these 3 years. Number one, some of the things were beyond our control, such as the global economic slowdown that has also affected Namibia. We have lower commodity prices that has led to a contraction in our mining sector, looking at 2015 contracting by 4.5% and 2016 contracting by 5.8%. Also, if you look at the drought, that has also affected the agricultural sector, feeding through into our manufacturing sector, looking at your meat processing, food products, and beverages. If you look at that target, I think we have understood that target, and especially with the Harambee Prosperity Plan targeting 7% of growth and higher. And if you look at the average growth over the last 3 years, that was around 2%, compared to a 3% that we have seen in 2018, 2010, a period that was more similar as the one that we're facing now. Just moving on to improved job creation, because that's also one of the targets that he has set. If you look at our broad unemployment, that has increased by 5.9% in 2016, that's to 34%. And especially if you look at your youth unemployment, that is estimated around 43% compared to the 39% that was recorded in 2014. And most of the jobs were shared in your agricultural sector, and we know why that is. It's because of the drought. We have seen jobs being shared in your wholesale and retail. Specifically, if you look at the Angolians exiting the market, I think that is attributed to that. And only about 2% jobs were added in the mining sector. But if you look at your manufacturing sector, though, we have about a 54% jobs created in that sector. I know that the president has set targets around the manufacturing sector, but if you look at unemployment, you should look at it as a whole. And if you look at it in a whole, you see that we have shared about 35,000 jobs since 2014 to 2016, which is quite a high number. One of the positive things that we have attained, I think, is the president have mentioned that we should maintain our import cover at 3 months during the Harambee Prosperity Plan, and we have done that with foreign reserves ticking up to above 28 billion. And also the fact that we had stability in the country, but even with stability, you should expect economic stability to come through. Looking at our public debt, One of the targets, again, around public debt is to anchor public debt as a percentage of GDP to 30%, and I think we have also missed the target with regards to that. The government debt has more than doubled over the last 3 years now, with domestic debt increasing by 103%. And I think it's just unattainable to bring it back to 30% within the Harambee Prosperity Plan, especially now debt to GDP or government debt to GDP being estimated around 43%. If you look at maintaining and improving the international credit rating at BBB-, I think we have also missed the mark in that due to outstanding invoices as well as failure to contain our growing debt levels and concentration risk within the economy. I think we have seen Moody's as well as Fitch downgrading Namibia, and again, we have missed the mark in that regard. Policies and how they impact the economy, I think, like Graham have mentioned, we have Harambee Prosperity Plan, we have NDP 5, we have Vision 2030. Namibia has too many plans at hand, and I think it goes without saying, it's not plans, more plans that we need, but a lot of implementation, and we really need to look at strategies as how to implement some of these targets that we are setting for ourselves. Just looking at the manufacturing sector as well as the infrastructure development. If you look at our development expenditure, that's about 13% of the entire budget, which I think is little, and at least 20% of that should go to our development expenditure just to achieve some of the targets that we have set. If you look at about 80% of the budget goes to operational expenditure, of which 50% goes to wages, then we really need to look at our wage bill in order to attain some of the development targets that we have set for ourselves. Just to leave you with this, I think some of the pro-growth government structural policies that we should follow is sound fiscal policy, looking at public sector should intrude minimally on the private sector. Competition within private sector should be encouraged. We should have infrastructure and human capital development that should be supported. And lastly, the tax policy needs to be sound. And I think that is not coming out clear as yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Ndileni. Thank you so much for those interventions. I think when we get into the Q&A session, we'll get more into that. Whatever jumps out at you, please take notes, and we'll address those during the engagement. Honorable Vanani, I'd like to move on to you now. And I think all of us are clear on the role of what the opposition should play, specifically the official opposition. And from your perspective as the leader of the official opposition, what is your assessment of President Geingob's time in office so far? What would you say have been some of the highs and lows since he took office, and what are the challenges that we need to be addressing urgently?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, fellow panelists, and the entire community, citizenry of our republic that are here with us. It is a very sad scenario for an official opposition leader to make an assessment on his immediate adversary. But as a country that has adopted the system of democracy, we ought to do that. And I will do that in the fairest manner that I know best. Let me start off by saying that what are the highs of President Geingob? His biggest high is that he is a president of rhetoric. He knows how to mix the statements that the people want. But whether he matches that rhetoric with action, I doubt whether he is achieving that rhetoric with action. But the biggest achievement of his presidency was that he declared his assets publicly, which was something very positive, and I commend him for that, sincerely. He has achieved to bring in a sort of a people's contract with government officials through performance contract. Ministers signing up for performance contract. It's a very laudable exercise that he has brought into governance. He has also brought in two important initiatives that I credit him for. One is the increase in the pensioners' the 1,200 grants that he's giving to pensions, because it is a party policy that we were talking about over the years, but then he has implemented it. And I credit him for that because it has really done a bigger dent on fighting poverty. I also credit him, contrary to many people that disagree with him, for bringing in a food bank initiative. But what he has failed with the food bank initiative was to create a maintenance policy to maintain the effectiveness of that implementation, because you need to create food security. You need to have food security in your country for you to be able to give food free. But what we are doing with the food bank is that we are importing food and giving it to people. The people need the food. It's important that you have such a policy in fighting poverty, but you have to have an homegrown strategy to make sure that you create food sustainability within your own country. Those are the highs that I want to give him, and I commend him for that. But let's come to the serious business of the lows. The lows are the following: that the president is vacillating with his rhetoric on corruption. He comes out as a very big anti-corruption campaigner. But the action that he takes, he was the person that was protecting SME board of directors that have lost 200 million, saying that they have done nothing wrong, while they have not even done their fiduciary duty to make sure that they protect that company. $200 million of the SME bank, money that was meant to create small and medium enterprises, money that was meant for the young people to create startups in this country, has gone missing. We don't have a judicial inquiry from the head of state as to fighting corruption. He talks about that he has cancelled an airport tender. Cancelling a tender does not really fight corruption. You cancel a tender for those people to continue and go and design a new tender program. What you need to do is that you need to get to the bottom of it, that who has inflated the tender at the airport and where are those people still having jobs in our country. So when the biggest baggage of President Geingob is that he is not fighting corruption head on. And I tell you why. Because a number of procurement, all major government procurement tenders are going through corruption. And people are known that are designing these programs, especially inside trading in government. But we have not seen a much robust action against corruption in the country. And we are losing a lot of resources from corruption. Let's go to the targets, the economic targets. One of the biggest things that are putting a bane on our national budget is the state-owned enterprises. State-owned enterprises and the erosion of corporate governance in the country are probably one of the highest bane that is draining the coffers of the state. Go to Namibia, for example. Namibia, the target in Harambee is that in the period of Harambee, we will be able to put infrastructure of 625 kilometers of rail. We know we don't have the money. I know the answer. We don't have the money because for us to put Namibia back to work, we need to improve the infrastructure, and the bill that would cost to improve that infrastructure would be 9.6 billion, money that we do not have. As we are speaking today, 700 employees at Namibia do not have 700 employees do not have what you call job descriptions. So there is a serious erosion of corporate governance at our state-owned enterprises. And we are pushing in money in that direction, where board of directors are telling us they have turnaround strategies, but they are not turning around these strategies. They are running these companies down into the drain, and we are still pushing money. Air Namibia, for example, a very good example that we are pushing in money into Air Namibia every year, but the only route where Air Namibia is making money is between Windhoek and Odangwa. And we are competing with international airlines across the globe. The very foundation why the Arab or the Emirates airlines are making profit is because of their geographical proximity, but because they are in excess of 8 hours over to 52% of the world population. And that's why they are making money. Of course, they were subsidized over a number of years until the legislation came in not to subsidize them. So what we need to do with our state-owned enterprises? We need to reform them. We need to go into strategic alliances. For example, Air New Zealand. There is an airline, a very small airline called Air New Zealand in New Zealand. New Zealand has realized that they can't compete with the bigger airlines due to geographical proximity, but they are making profits around smaller destinations. So Air Namibia can also be downsized so that it suits our bill, as opposed to sending over 7 billion money that needs to build housing, create jobs in our country that we are sending to the state-owned enterprises. Let's talk about the budget. When a new president enters office, the way that he budgets should change from a previous leader who was in office. Namibia is spending per capita 4.2% of our GDP on defense. We don't have a war in the region. We are hoping to protect the sovereignty of our country at a bill that is creating poverty for the rest of the country. In fact, the United States is spending 4.4% of their GDP on defense. Namibia is spending 4.2%. Where is our priority? Do we need to send money, billions of dollars, into defense as opposed to creating jobs for the young? The targets of Harambee is to create jobs in the next 2-3 years. But the jobs, we are not creating jobs, we are losing jobs because of a struggling economy. And what do we need to do to create jobs? We need to create youth venture capitals in our country for small and medium enterprises to be able to do startups. But while you create a bank that should create those startups, the directors are borrowing themselves, and the bigger companies that are not even SMEs are the ones borrowing from the SME bank. So where do you draw the line of creating jobs? Because when you talk about prosperity, we should try to quantify and define what is prosperity. Prosperity would mean housing for the people. Namibia has the highest housing prices in our country, nearly in the whole of Africa and in the world. Why? Because the mortgage lending rates of the financial banking institutions have not been checked. Banks are over-profiteering from the housing schemes in our country.
Books, please.
All right. I thought I wanted... Okay, let me conclude by saying the wage bill. We have been talking about a huge wage bill in our country, that government can't be the employer, but it must create a conducive environment for jobs to be created by the SMEs. For as long as government is not listening, we will have a serious problem. I, in my opinion, do not believe that the targets of Harambee will be met in 2020. They are not going to be met.
Thank you, Mr. Benoni. Great. And finally, it's great that we have the economic advisor from the Office of the Presidency here, Dr. Statler. And I'd like to ask you to provide us with a bit of an overview of where things are currently in terms of the Harambee Prosperity Plan. I think there have been some insights already coming in, and you can start to address those if you'd like to in your comments. What are the challenges that have been faced so far also that have kept us from meeting some of these targets, specifically on the economic targets? And what are some of the tough decisions that the President has had to take in terms of moving towards meeting these development objectives?
Well, thank you, Nangula, and also I want to thank fellow panelists, and also a great thank you to the audience for coming out in big numbers. I want to maybe just pick up with what Graham said when he concluded it. Namibia is a great country, and I think we have a fantastic narrative that's holding in Namibia. And sometimes we are not aware of what's really happening in Namibia. But be that as it may, the question was, how are we faring on the Harambee Prosperity Plan 2 years after it was released? Before coming to the Harambee Prosperity Plan, I just want to also explain how government planning is done in the case of Namibia. Of course, as alluded to, we have the Vision 2030, which is the long-term plan, and that plan is aimed at industrializing Namibia and making Namibia a high-income country. And then you have the NDPs, which are short-term plans, and the Harambee Prosperity Plan, which is an accelerated impact plan. So, but as we are monitoring, the focus is not only on the Harambee Prosperity Plan. The idea is just to pick some aspects that we say we want to make bigger impact in. And there are some things that continue to be important. Take, for example, the issue of vocational technical education training. This where governments say over the next 4 years we want to impact. But that doesn't mean we can neglect overall education. We cannot neglect early childhood development. We cannot neglect basic education. And we also cannot neglect tertiary education. So as we implement the Harambee Prosperity Plan, one has to keep the eye on the ball on all these other developments.
You may, for example, if you don't keep your eye on the ball, you may have students that are not ready for vocational education training. But what we are saying is, under HPP, we want to focus a little bit. So in terms of the HPP, I think many of you are aware it has been designed around 5 pillars. And maybe let me just say briefly about performance under each of these pillars. The first pillar, of course, is effective governance and service delivery. And I think, Graham has given kind of a good overview of how we've been performing there. I think there is one of the pillars where we have been performing quite well. Number one was the issue on improved transparency, in the sense that here the president of the country has released his income and his assets publicly, also his wife. We've also seen that ministers have released their incomes and their assets. And recently, in the media, all over the media, we have seen that it was out there. These ministers are owning shares here or land there. And I think this transparency is very good. And that's for me one of the successes under the first pillar of the Harambee Prosperity Plan. I also agree with Graham that the fact that we have now introduced performance management at a highest level, that's also a plus. Now, performance management, I can tell you, and anyone that works in a company or everywhere, is that performance management is something that doesn't take, you can never perfect it. It's an ongoing process. And I think there are valuable lessons we have drawn from performance contracting in the first 2 years. Sometimes it may be goals that have been overstated. Goals are not smart enough. How do you track goals? And I think through the performance management system, it enables us to check where the focus really should be and how we can refine the goals. We have also started to, under that chapter, to bring in the issue of improved service delivery, including through ICT. And there are a number of ICT tools that have become available during the first 2 years of the Harambee Prosperity Plan. On the economic pillar, I don't want to say too much. I think Ndeleni has stats on it. And the story about the economic environment has been talked a lot upon. But I think for me, where I see is how we have handled the economic environment. I think the fact that today, 2 years after the economic downturn, we can say that our international reserves have increased to about 4.6 months of import coverage. I think that's something good that has happened. And also, if we can see that the pace of debt, yes, it has escalated, but the fact that the increase in debt, it's starting to decelerate. I think that's something good. And it may be that we will not hit the 30% benchmark debt to GDP ratio, but I think we are still in a good space. Mind you, for example, some of the sustainability targets or indicators on debt is as high as 60%, and some countries are even above 60%. So I think it's something that we can still manage. Where we have done more progress, I think, is on the social progression pillar. In the interest of time, I just want to maybe single out one or two. I think the fact that the pension, social pension, the pension for old age, for the elderly was increased, as Honorable Vanania said, has made a huge impact. Why is it? It's because, poverty impacted the household, and pensioners spend the money in the household. And I think we can see that impact in the household. We see the impact, and we hear the stories that people are telling us on what a difference that social grant has made. I think on vocational technical education training also, there's a beautiful story developing there. As at the end of this year, last year, about close to 30,000 young Namibians were enrolled at vocational technical education centers. That's almost like double the figure we had 3-4 years ago. And we all know that to build a nation, that we need to have vocational education skills. So I think we are starting to make inroads there, and people are starting to change perceptions about vocational education training. My time is also up, and I haven't touched on some of the other pillars. So let me just look again at infrastructure. Without going into details, I think that was a pillar that has been affected by budgetary constraints. But despite that, there are some infrastructure that we have continued to roll out. One of the areas that I think we've made some good progress is on the REFIT program, the renewable energy, where about 40 megawatts have already been established under the solar power. Yes, on the rail, that's very expensive, a very expensive project. But here the approach, Honorable Fanani, is also to explore if we can't do it through triple P arrangements. And I think the President has already indicated that. And there's been consultations with industry. And it seems, there's also a willingness from the industry, especially from the mining sector, to say, but look, we don't want to transport mineral ore on road. Let us be part of the solution to make the rail work in Namibia. Also on water, that was a huge crisis about 2 years ago. I think this is one of the highlights of the Harambee Prosperity Plan is that we've managed to come up with short-term water solutions, and there are some longer-term plans that have been developed and that we should be able to roll out faster once economic conditions have improved. Dangula, I've gone way over my time. Yes. I apologize for it, but I think there are just so much to say about the Harambee Prosperity Plan. Yes. At 7 minutes was not enough, but maybe through questions and answers we'll get to some of it.
I completely understand, and during the engagement session, which we will begin now, I'm sure that some of those issues will come up, and if you'd like to also, you can address some of those in your closing remarks that are most important. So let's give our panelists a round of applause for their interventions.
I'm Diane Hubbard from the Legal Assistance Center. I just wanted to comment that none of the panelists have mentioned gender at all, which is partly perhaps because the Harambee plan is not very strong on gender. But poverty is a very gendered issue, and development is related, intertwined with gender equality. And our failure to improve on gender-based violence certainly has an economic and societal cost. So I just wanted to point out that I think it's important that we not lose that important aspect of examining the success of Harambee.
My name is Tobias Joseph. I'm from the PDM office, Parliament. I have several questions, but I'm going to restrict maybe to 2 or 3. The Harambee Prosperity Plan talks about free press. And first, I should say, we are talking about 3 years of Geingob, or Honorable the President, Mr. Geingob, and he's not here, and I don't think that's free press. We are talking mostly to ourselves. In South Africa, when people are making events like this, the President are always present, and I should start with that one as a comment. I don't think we have free press in Namibia, because the presses are mostly limited to the President's invites to different events, maybe State of the Nation address. That's only the place where the President get to interact with people, like in Parliament, and the press don't get to ask questions there. Okay, that's one. The second question, the question is that what do we define as free press in that Harambee Prosperity Plan? What's the definition there? How do we think that the press is free?
Thank you, moderator. I particularly want to engage anybody on the panel because I'm troubled. Part of the problem would be that at independence we adopted in the principles of state policy this so-called mixed economy. Nobody have ever defined to us what is mixed economy. I know in the DTA constitution they openly support capitalism. So which is the same thing. So probably whatever it means. So I think that that begins to be part of a problem. And that problem goes now 28 years later. John, since you are close to the men, to the president, you could probably take a lead in this engagement. Now, what troubles me in terms of our economic policy is that we say whatever we say, but we're told that 800,000 Namibians live on debt, of which 80% is housing bond. We are told by UNESCO Institute of Statistics that in 2015, more than 100,000 kids are not in school, but they're supposed to be in school. We say what we say, but we are told that by government itself, over the past 5 years, every year, 50,000 learners drop out of school. We say what we say, but we are also told that 500,000 Namibians live in informal settlements, and the number is increasing. John, when he was director of CEO of a statistics agency, told us that. Now, the problem that we begin to have is that of a contradiction. We are performing very well, social progression, economic policy, and all those things. But every day, this statistic keeps coming up. So you struggle to understand. So, John, you came from China, and we had this conversation with you a lot, and I don't see progress. That when we speak of our economic policy, at what point do we begin to talk about the developmental state? Now, the developmental state is not just what people speak about. The developmental state is a state with the specific performances. Evidently, government is very close to the private sector that proposes for neoliberalism. South Africa had an experiment with gear under Thabo Mbeki, which is almost similar, probably 60% of Harambee. But that would never take us towards a developmental state. So what do you, because I cannot understand, for example, we have tenders, people importing, you get a tender to buy the military uniform, you get a tender for the police, you get a tender to buy uniform for the nurses in China.
John,
but
may
every
I ask
street,
to wrap up, please?
Yes, but every street you have a meme that make clothes. Many young people are making the same clothes that Nangura is wearing. And we can't get government to say, for example, we have Ramatex that have closed down, to say that everybody that have skills in terms of all these aspects, that is industrialization, you create jobs. No matter how much rhetoric you say at 3 years, 2 years, 5 years, if we don't see practical changes, it will just be a story full of fairy, but it signifies nothing.
Good evening, Dixon Mombola. Now, my question is to Mr. Vanani, when he addressed the issue of the defense. The question at hand here, Mr. Vanani, is that you're saying that there are no wars in the region at the moment. And you're saying that the money spent on defense is too much. What happens when a war breaks out or when we are invaded? Because what you need to understand is that military warfare is changing by the day. And we as a nation who wants to keep our sovereign state as it is, we need to be updated with this. At the other hand, history shows us that any nation without a strong military is easily subdued or is invaded. And we also know that Namibia is rich in many resources that countries out there are looking for. So in my question to you, Mr. Vanani, is what do we do in that state then, since you have now handicapped the country from the military?
To you. Whoever's ready to take on a question? Sure.
Well, let me start with the first question about the gender mainstreaming in our planning of our state. I think I agree with you that you cannot push back the frontiers of poverty without bringing in the context of single mothers in society. And no way in the world have you ever pushed back frontiers of poverty without bringing in the gender element. And it's a policy of my party, it's a manifesto policy that single mothers should get support so that children can get a fair startups in life. So we agree with you. Now, to my young man who's talking about defense, it's a narrative that is as old as the mountain, that we need to defend ourselves so that one day people don't take from us. But what do people take from poor people? What do people take from poor people? You need to create a conducive economic environment for your people to have housing. You can't have a country where you have 500,000 people living in shanty towns and you are spending the same money as the biggest military in the world, and you are saying you are preparing yourself for a would-be war. How many defense pact have we signed with the SADC region? How many defense pact have we signed with a plethora of nations across the world? Namibia cannot afford to spend 4.2% of its resource, 4.2% of its GDP on defense, while we have a plethora of other needs in the country, like it or not. So I would have a situation where I create more jobs, create better housing, create more health facilities for people, for a country to be able to prosper, not to spend a fortress on defense and having a poor country. Zimbabwe is one good example. They have a very strong defense, but Zimbabwe is on its knees. Are we creating another Zimbabwe? We shouldn't do that. Let me end by saying, to touch on the dialectics of materialism that my brother is trying to come to. In fact, the ruling party, and I understand you are also a member of the ruling party, the ruling party has failed ideologically. Because SWAPO started as a communist socialist party. In fact, the policy that they are pursuing now, it's our party's policy. We believe in a free market economy, and we don't shy away from that. You need to create a smaller government and a bigger private sector to be able to create jobs in the country. And it's a policy that we hold dear to. So I think the ruling party should ask itself the question whether its ideological positioning is helping their political progression. I don't think it helps them. But if we want to implement our policy, we can be able to implement it in such a way that we create a very robust, jobs can only be created by SMEs. And if we do not create those SMEs, jobs will never be created. Even if you train 30,000 Namibians, but you are importing wheelbarrows from China or any other country, that doesn't speak to the jobs that you want to create. And we must be very fair that we are not creating, the job market cannot absorb our people that we are training, and we must be able to create and train people that can be absorbed in the job market. For as long as we are bringing foreigners to come and do manual jobs, Kapanas being competed with foreigners, then we have a problem in our country, and we have to do something about it.
Thank you, Mr. Vanani. Dr. Seidel, would you like to respond on media engagement? And I think it's important to state regarding that question that we do have someone from the Office of the Presidency here. So I think that in itself shows some level of engagement. But if you could respond specifically to the issue of engaging the media and how free the media is at the moment.
Thank you, Nangula. I just also wanted to acknowledge the question on gender. I think that's a very important question. In the case of HPP, there was not a specific chapter on it, but the gender issues are generally mainstreamed in other government policies. But Graham also hinted maybe we should have a HPP too, and when it comes, then we can give a much more gender perspective in the HPP too, if it comes. But on the question of the media, it had two components. One is, how do we define press freedom? So in the case of the Harambee Prosperity Plan, we adopted the definition of Transparency International. So basically, Transparency International definition is a number of subcomponents. And I can't recall all the components of heart. But take, for example, one component speaks of abuse towards journalists. And they say in some countries in the world, journalists get locked up if they disagree with what the government wants, with government policy. In some countries of the world, journalists even get killed. So in the case of Namibia, we don't have that abuse. And so when you look at the abuse sub-index of Transparency International, Namibia gets a high score. Because every time, in terms of the methodology of Transparency International, every time there is a mistake that you make when you control the media, you get points assigned to you. And the higher your points, then the less press freedom you have. So basically, it's a measurement that we have adopted from outside. And I think it's fair that we have adopted from outside instead of us saying that, well, the media is the press freedom is there and so on. But I think just generally, I think one can concur there are really not incidences where there's a clampdown on the press in the case of Namibia. And I think journalists that are perhaps here will be in a better position to also give an opinion on it. But let's appreciate the press freedom that we have. In terms of the media events of the president, I think this is also something that I would have highlighted for me as one of the highlights of the Harambee Prosperity Plan. Generally, you find that the events of president, media houses are always invited. We have a database, and as soon as there's an event, our media department will send out an invite. Sometimes you find that we have many, depending on the topic, there will be a big interest. Sometimes the topic is not interesting, and then one or two media houses will come. But it's definitely not restricted only to the State of the Nation address and to big events. And what's even more important, and I've witnessed it at many occasions, is that in most of the discussions President has, is that the media will be there throughout. At no point will the media be asked to excuse and say that they are private discussions. Recently, we had an engagement with the trade unions. And I think at some point the unions asked, but Comrade President, can we ask the media to be excused because we want to raise issues that could be sensitive. And then based on that, President said, okay, if you don't want the media to be, it's okay, but generally we don't have any objection if the media sits throughout in most of our events. There could be some events that, and those are very rare, where the media will be restricted towards the opening ceremonies, but then they can stay and ask questions afterwards to whoever was invited to State House. Job, the question on the economy, I think we need, in the interest of time, to have a separate debate on it. But basically, mixed economy, we have been, when you sit in government, you get kind of views from different perspectives. On the one hand, there are some people that will say, but this is like a free market economy. On the other hand, and I think there are also people in the audience that will say, hey, but government is just doing everything. Government must get out of the economy. So I think, we still adhere to the principle of mixed economy. There's space for private sector activities, but in some instances, there's also room for government to come in because of structural issues that we have in the economy that may not necessarily be good for the private sector to take the lead in bringing development to some places. Thank you.
My question is a simple question based on leadership structure. I think it's more addressed to ECN, Election Commission of Namibia. Why I'm bringing up this question is local authorities. It's such an embarrassment to sit down to my councillors and listen to the comments they made whenever we are trying to address agendas that are based on economy, based on development, and based on the growth of a country. So from the panel, if you can maybe just enlighten us in terms of grassroots levels, how councillors and leaders in local communities are elected. And I think it's high time that we really take this serious. We have incompetent people in positions in the government, especially in the local authority level, that cannot make important decisions. And I think this is one of the points we in Harambee we should address. And I think it's very important we should maybe touch on that agenda and why, in basic summary, all I'm saying is leadership quality is failing us on the lower grassroots level in local authorities. So thank you very much.
My name is Harald Schütt. I'm the General Manager of the Renewable Energy Industry Association of Namibia. We have enough money to finance Harambee from here to the moon and back. Are you interested? Are you aware that every year we are exporting to the tune of 2.6 billion, that is 2,600 million Namibian dollars, to buy ready-made kilowatt hours from Zambia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa? By that, we are financing the erection of infrastructure in these countries, which is maybe noble, but I'm not sure that we can afford that. From the point of view of the industry, I can tell you it is a walk in the park to electrify Namibia 100% from renewable sources, and on top of that, become an energy exporting country. In the moment, we are importing 60% of our electricity, which is totally unnecessary and very expensive and keeps us being dependent on the conditions on other countries. We can easily do that, and we can produce energy cheaper than the grid can deliver it on each of your roofs. I'm producing on my roof for $1.20. My tariff is $1.35. So a few regulations, and we're also ready with the regulations, and we have even offered State House to come and explain it to them, but since 1.5 years, we are not getting an answer. However, also the regulations that need to be changed are known. There are other countries who have done it. We can learn from them, and we can adapt them to Namibian conditions. And I promise you, everybody here, it is not a problem. And if any of you are still using electrical water heating, you're throwing out money with a big hand out of the window. And if you want to invest wise, invest in renewable energy on your roof, because the more renewable energy systems we have on your roofs, the more it will become mainstream. And last not least, we should not allow people to still build new houses with electrical water heaters, because they're a huge waste. I cannot go into detail, but they're a huge waste. And we should also not allow people to still build houses without solar panels as their roof.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Shelley from PSG Namibia. There were some proud comments made about the foreign reserves being much improved and the import cover being held at admirable levels. How much of this is because of the Eurobond that was issued in 2015, I believe?
Thank you for that question. We'll take one more question for this round. Somewhere at the back, I think, close to the middle, there's someone standing already and ready to go. Let's take it to him.
I'm Vijay from University of Namibia. I have a few questions to ask, only 2 questions. We are talking about industrialization, but there seems to be no research going on towards industrialization. Okay, there is no proper funding in the tertiary institutions for research purposes. The next thing is, everybody is so appreciating, everybody declared their assets and everything. But my question is, these assets somebody declaring now who are in positions, in political positions, did Ministry of Finance investigated how come they accumulated so much assets over this period of time? Did they pay enough taxes on it? What happened? How come they could accumulate this much wealth? So there is a possibility of income tax rates that the Ministry of Finance can have on all these people who declare their assets and find out investigate how they accumulated this wealth, and whether they paid the taxes for those assets that they accumulated. That has to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vijay.
Just starting off with whether we can afford our own energy, and just with that, I think one of the problems that we have, and I highlighted on that, is the fact that most of the money is going to operational expenditure, and most of that is our wages. And just to add with that, I think if we do away with high public wage bill, then we will be able to afford some of the energies or the plants that we can have to, or afford our own energy. The other thing I think is doing away with I think the other thing is doing away with financing inefficient SOEs. And if we do that, I think we would have enough money to set up our own energy plants. I think our tax administration system is also a little bit not proper. And if we look at that and we collect enough taxes, we would have enough money to then set up some of these plants. And then just on the question on foreign reserves, we know that a majority of that is the Eurobond. And plus, what's also fueling the foreign reserves is the money that's coming from Angola, since Angola is still paying paying the amount outstanding, which is coming to an end in June. So it will be quite interesting to see how foreign reserves will continue from then. We have seen that it has dropped to 26 billion in February, in March, and it will be quite interesting to see how we'll keep up with our foreign reserves. Most of it was fueled by the Eurobond as well as the loan.
Great, thank you, Ndileni. Graham, if you could speak to the questions around whether it's time for a Vision 2030 review. Also, how do we address the slow culture that we're seeing when it comes to implementation, and any of the other questions that speak to your work?
Okay, thanks. It's definitely time for a review of Vision 2030. It was adopted in 2004, and I don't think we've ever really had a serious discussion about it since then, in terms of even considering whether it's still applicable. I'm not sure that everything in there is. We need to have an honest and open discussion about it. And so definitely we need to look at that. In terms of the slowness of government, I mean, I think there are probably lots of factors, but I would say one of the key ones is leadership, or maybe the lack of leadership. We know the fish rots from the head, and I think when you have managers who are not doing their jobs, who are not even turning up for work, and this is based on anecdotal evidence of what people say happens in some parts of government, then you know, the people lower down aren't going to get on with their jobs either, and then just the pace and the belief in what you're doing disappears, and it just becomes a job that you take home money from for every month. So we have to change that culture. I think Harambee and their ideas around Harambee could help that, because if there is a genuine belief in the vision of Harambee and ownership, then that can get people inspired and believing in what they're doing again. And that's why if we do have Harambee 2, we need a broad consultation to make sure it is applicable in all its sense. Gender did go missing. We did a paper on that at the IPPR, and you know, we need to make sure there aren't those kind of omissions again if we do revisit Harambee. There's also an issue to do with somebody mentioned the quality of the councillors, local authority and regional council level. I think it's much down to the political parties actually to train their junior politicians, their emerging politicians to play a proper professional role at that level. But there's another issue, which is another word that's gone missing, which is decentralization. We had a whole policy and plan in the year 2000. We hardly mention it anymore. So we need to go back to that and try to get decentralization to work in the sense of having capacity and responsibility and power at the local level to implement policies. Not everything can be dictated from Windhoek.
Thanks, Graham. Honorable Vanaani, I know you got very excited when you heard the Vision 2030 question. So if you can touch very briefly on that, and then on any of the other questions that spoke to you.
Well, there's an old English adage that says, straight talks breaks no friendship. Nowhere in the world is a country that industrializes without achieving food sustainability and food security. Your very first step of industrialization is to be able to feed your own people. For as long as your country is a net importer of foodstuff, forget about industrialization. Because if you look at the industrialization revolution, whether by the Asian tigers or the European countries, it was first ignited by agricultural modernization. Now, for as long as you have people in Kavango farming with oxen, with an oxen, a method used in other countries 300 years ago, forget about industrialization. So there is a need to review Vision 2030. And when you are talking about industrialization, you must also have a critical analysis into what areas do you want to industrialize. What is it that Namibia wants to industrialize in? Is it pharmaceuticals? Is it oil products? What are those areas? And then you have to create a critical mass of skills for those people, engineers for you, for your people to be able to enter those markets in which you want to industrialize. We have not even identified the areas in which we want to industrialize. So I think there is a greater need to review Vision 2030. The slowness of government is one of the biggest bane of implementation. The Ministry of Public Enterprises was created by the President with pomp and fanfare that he wants to rein in on the erosion of corporate governance and he wants to put things in order. But the legislation that must empower the Ministry of Public Enterprises for it to be able to function as a proper Ministry of Public Enterprises is yet to come to the National Assembly.
Mike, to make sure that the light on it is green, the feed is not coming through for the...
It is green, yes.
Okay. Please go ahead, apologies.
So if you have a ministry that was created 3 years ago with all the stuff being put in place, but yet the bill that must empower them to do their work has not even seen the light of the National Assembly, what slowness do you need to know? That government is not implementing what it needs to do. In fact, we were supposed to start with creating a bill before creating a ministry, but we did it the other way around. Come to the other issue of the renewable energy. You have raised a very fundamental issue, and there is a motion coming into the National Assembly that corruption is a problem in our society. Every major project has inside traders. Today we are sitting with Baines. That would cost us billions of dollars to build. We are sitting with Kutuges. But we have not looked at a much cheaper option of renewable energy. In fact, every Namibian can put solars, if we bring proper regulation, can put solars in his own yard and be able to sell electricity, small scale, sell electricity to the grid. Those things can happen in this country. But because there are billions to be made in those big tenders, we are going for them. You are not the only person that the State House is avoiding. Mind you, I'm the leader of the opposition in the Republic. I've not seen the president. You know that for the last 3 years, State House is saying I've never written a letter, they have not answered. But I have a plethora of letters. And I meet international leaders, leaders of nations all over the world due to the position that I hold in the country. But I've not met my president to have a discussion. One thing that is lacking in this country is that you have a powerful ruling party with a 2/3 majority. And their listening skills and power becomes very limited. They are not listening to a number of advices that we need to take this country forward. And we are all patriotic to the ethos and values of Namibia's socio-economic trajectory. But we must listen to one another. And we don't have a robust engagement in a country that can take our country forward. The issue of accumulation of wealth, if you read the newspaper, the very first, when we declared our assets, my first question, my first reply to the Namibian newspaper that dared to ask me the question, I said, we should look at how many of these people. How can you be a minister for 7 years or 10 years and you own assets of 50 million? You can't explain it. So there is a number of people that have wealth that they can't explain in this country. And that's reality. Perhaps those that are saying they are going to do auditing, lifestyle audits, should be able to do that. Because that's the reality, that we talk about declaring our assets, but we don't talk about where did we get those cattle from, or where did we inherit those shareholdings that we have in major companies across the world and the banks that we have across the world. So I think I agree with you on that.
Wrap up so that we can just get Dr. Statler's input, go to Twitter, and then do closing remarks.
I'll wrap up by saying the following. We do have a great country, a very small population. We can do things right in this country. But we must start a genuine conversation that does not steal from the people. We should not steal from the people through corruption and procurement of deals and think that we are going to develop Namibia. Namibia can only be developed if we put our action in order and working in the interest of the populace that we prepared to lead. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Seidel, would you like to respond to any of those questions from the previous round?
I think there was a question on local authorities and leadership. Maybe I will just reply with a question also and ask the young man. I suppose you are a very competent leader. Why don't you stand for elections at the local level? I think that could be the good start. And based on that also similarly, you know, when we speak of the fight against corruption, there's a Whistleblowers Protection Act and a Witness Protection Act. I've been in meetings at State House where people have come and say, Mr. President, Your Excellency, we know of cases of corruption. And we say, okay, can you expose the corruption? So I think a lot of things starts with ourselves. You know, we speak of issues, but then when we have to come forward then we say, no, I've just heard it from somebody. I'm not so certain what I've heard. So I think it's very important, to really come out. If we say that the corruption is a big problem, come out, speak out, open up cases, go to the Anti-Corruption Commission. The issue on industrialization, there's been a lot of research done on industrialization. I think that some of the research are out there. Even the ministry has identified sectors. Sectoral studies, value chain studies have been done. But I think it's also here where sometimes we need to be aware of what information is out there. And maybe as OMAS, we also have to come out, offices, ministries, and agencies, come out and publicize some of this information. Because I know value chain studies that have been done in, for example, mineral beneficiation, pharmaceutical industry, whether it's viable in the case of Namibia, agro industries. So these are all things that are out there. But we also need a bit of entrepreneurial flair to be able to industrialize. Take, for example, we have now the new Procurement Act. The new Procurement Act makes provision for up to 35% local content. But it's up to entrepreneurs to come up with products and say, look, but I meet all the requirements. Why is it that I'm being discriminated against? There's also the retail charter that complies, or that at least encourages the retail outlets that we have here in Namibia to make retail space available for Namibian products. And I must say there are some Namibian products that you start to see they are displayed on the retail space, in retail shelves. But I do admit that we need to do more to develop the entrepreneurial flair. And it cannot be only up to the state to develop the entrepreneurial flair. On the issue of the import coverage, yes, in the beginning that was the Eurobond, but only a portion of the Eurobond has been ring-fenced in a redemption fund, because at some point that Eurobond has to be redeemed, but not all of it. So it explains for some part of it. But what has happened also last year that's supporting the import coverage has been a huge drop in our imports. And that huge drop in the imports is also partly because of the fiscal consolidation that we've seen. One would like to see, of course, in future that exports also pick up a bit, and that hopefully that trend could be sustainable. In the long run, for us to have sustained import coverage, we need to export more. We need to work more on the productive structure of the economy. And I think those are things that we are looking at in government. What can we do to really stimulate productive activities, not only in the agricultural sector, but also in other sectors, even in automotive sector. I can give you an example that now we have, after a long time, through investment promotion, an agreement was reached to start an assembly plant for motor vehicles in Namibia. In fact, we expect the first vehicles to get off the assembly line by October. Now, this is not something huge, but it's a step in the right direction for us to be able to say, yes, in stage one, at least we can assemble a certain type of vehicle. Maybe in the next stage, we can do more than just the assembling. And we can link also in the regional value chain. Because for us to develop value chains, I think we also have to think regionally and globally.
Just to close off, I know that we are in a very tough economic environment, and there are certain things that are beyond our control. Like I've mentioned, commodity prices and the drought. Those are things that are beyond our control. But then certainly the things that are within our control, such as fiscal consolidation, we really need to see which developmental plans are we going to prioritize on. And for instance, government would I think government will have to cut expenditure in such a way that it doesn't affect critical sectors within the economy, such as your education and your health. And talking about education, I think we also need to redefine what is quality education. Is it really increasing teacher salary Or is it lowering the standard of education to get higher grades? So we need to redefine what is education, and also where is the money that we're putting into education, where is it really going to? Like I've mentioned, about 70% of the money allocated to education is on salaries. And then just lastly, I think accountability is one of the important things that we should have in government finances, to avoid things such as outstanding invoices, to avoid things like money of students getting lost and no one has any trace of it. So we need to relook at some of these things and the things that are within our control and really just address them in an efficient way.
Great, thank you, Indileni. Honorable Vanani.
Thank you. Well, the initiative of any foreign direct investment in our country is a good initiative. The assembly plant in Walvis Bay is a step in the right direction. I agree with such an initiative. But one thing that we need to do right in our country, we must stop the mentality of thinking that the country is big. We have a very small country and a small population that we need to address. For example, the student loans, NASAF. Have you seen the head office, the new head office of NASAF, how big it is? Just a body that needs to administrate student loans. Do we need such a big office to administrate loans of less than 100,000 students in the Republic? We must ask ourselves those questions. Are we spending our money in the right areas? Let's talk about how we have killed the construction industry in the country. We have given all our tenders, rightly or wrongly, we have given all our tenders to foreigners. Major procurement tenders were given to foreigners. And there was no trickling down effect of the economy because these foreigners were building the infrastructure, take the money to their shores, and the country is bleeding dry, and the construction industry is bleeding and it's on its knees. So those are the things that we need to do, that our procurement should also address the small men. That if a tender of 120 million is given, that 15 or 20 companies can be able to, one can do lighting, the other one can do tiles, so that we make sure that more and more people penetrate the economy of our society. What is it that we need to do differently? We need to change the property regime in Namibia. If you have a house in Umtele, if you have a house in Kasinakasi in Kavango, your house is treated as debt capital. Whereas if you have a house in Windhoek, you can go to Agribank or you can go to FNB and borrow money against your house and be able to take your child to school or be able to buy equipment. So the property regime in Namibia should be addressed. That we can't have in the communal areas a debt capital, what Hernando de Soto said, debt capital, and in other parts having commercial tradable capital. So it's one initiative that we can bring in to be able to address property regime. I disagree a little bit with the economic pundits that says that because of the economic situation, the headwinds and this, this is why our economy is doing weak. We should not forget that there are countries that had major droughts than us, like Ethiopia. Why is Ethiopia performing? Because their fundamentals are correct. Why is Mauritius performing over 4%? Because their fundamentals are correct. So there are things that we can do better for us to be able to, even to be able to challenge the headwinds that we are facing. And I think fiscal consolidation at this space is a good initiative. But we started late with it. During our good years, we should have started with it. We were spending too much money that we didn't have on projects that were not giving value on money. I want to end with agricultural modernization. That if you really want to take this country forward, the biggest industry that has the most people that are employable are in the agricultural sector. We need to be able to give support to the agricultural sector. If you look at our budget pattern, agriculture receives the least budget allocation as opposed to other sector. And I think it's a wrong thing. In conclusion, this country needs an economic summit where we call the country together and talk about what is the future that we want to chart for a new Namibia. What we have has not worked at this point in time. We need to engage one another robustly and argue our case that we have an economic model that everybody can follow and say, this is the model that we have agreed upon, and take it to the future. Thank you very much.
I want to end off by saying something about corruption, because corruption will undo all the progress that we've been talking about if we don't get it under control. And I take the signs from what the President has been saying this year, particularly when he reshuffled the cabinet, that he also senses that corruption is getting worse, that it's now at a tipping point in Namibia, and it could become endemic in the country if we don't tackle it now. Now, I think there's a number of practical things that can be done. John mentioned whistleblower protection, and it's good that we passed the law, but we noticed that it's not in the budget. There's no budget for a whistleblower protection office. That means another year wasted. We won't have any action on that. So we know we have financial problems, but I would rather see money spent on a whistleblower protection office than on a farm for the military. So we've got to get our priorities right. We need an access to information law. We're working with a coalition of civil society organizations in the Action Coalition to try and get this through with the government, with the Ministry of ICT this year, we hope. But it's also got to be a state-of-the-art access to information law, not one that actually tries to cover up and protect information. We need transparency in political finance. I see some of the parties have been publishing their financial details, accounts in the papers. Actually, if you look closely at that, I mean, they're not really required to tell us much. So we need a system like South Africa is introducing now, where we actually know who the individual donors are, because corruption grows out of the non-transparency in political finance. We don't really have a good asset declaration system in Namibia. It shouldn't be down to the president of his own volition to declare his assets. It should be a system where people are mandatory to do it. Why has only one minister followed him? We should have the whole cabinet ordered to declare in much greater detail than the parliamentarians what their assets are. And we need a workable system in Parliament whereby MPs face sanctions if they don't do it properly and if they don't tell the truth. Nobody checks it now. We don't even know if this thing is verified or not. And then it's good also that we have a new Public Procurement Act, and I think it is a much better system, but we need to monitor that very carefully to make sure it is working. So the last challenge I would say is it's not just down to government. I think we need a broad-based anti-corruption coalition in this country, made up of all sectors of society, to take this issue on, because if we don't stop it now, we know from countries like Nigeria and Kenya, once it does become endemic, once it's everywhere, you can't go back. You can't get it back. That's what the Kenyan civil society activists tell us. That's what the Nigerian civil society activists tell us. So let's make this year as part of the year of reckoning, a year of action on corruption. Thanks very much.
Great, and I think sort of just in closing and wrapping up, once again I'd like to highlight this IPPR report on 3 years of Geingob and Harambee at halftime. It provides a few more insights on the specific targets, but also on general promises made outside of the Harambee Prosperity Plan. I think our panelists have given us some important insights going forward and some real food for thought that we hope will also find the President's ear, Dr. Stedtler, but really in terms of, for example, looking at how we address corruption, looking at perhaps engaging in an economic summit, looking at issues around agriculture and what quality education should look like, and really taking care of the things that are within our control, given that there has been a lot that has not been. So I think a lot of engagement has happened where good ideas and actionable ideas have come out. I think something important that the President said at his first cabinet meeting, which I think resonates also with what the panelists have spoken about, was that he made clear his expectations on his team to deliver on their mandate. And he said, I'm counting on every one of us to step up in the implementation of government programs. We cannot continue at the same pace and mindset and somehow expect a different outcome. He said we cannot continue to make promises and not reckon. And I think it's very apt that this year is called the Year of Reckoning, and we need to see how things move forward then in terms of implementation. So thank you all so much for your insights. Thank you for your participation on this panel and for making the time to be here. Please, let's give our panelists another round of applause. And finally, just a heads up that the State of the Nation address is coming up next week on the 11th of April. So that's something to tune into in terms of looking at what is prioritized going forward. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out and for being here and for engaging with your questions and comments. Unfortunately, time doesn't allow us to stay here much longer, but I encourage you to continue to engage with us in the minutes after this and as we go out for a bit of for something to eat. Also, I'd like to thank DB Audio for their professional setup. DB Audio has come through very professionally each time, so let's just give them a round of applause for everything here. I'd like to thank the Nampower Convention Center also for hosting us here again. My colleagues at IPPR who have put in the work to make sure that this happened and that it happened well. A special shout out, of course, to Max and Salmi. And then to all our project partners, the Hanns Seidel Foundation, the Embassy of Finland, and the Namibian and IPPR, of course, for making this event happen. Thank you so much to all of you and for your engagement. And please join us for appetizers outside. Thank you.